Hello all, sorry about that. Let's see, what do we have today? Kind and kind, it's the main thing. Let's see if we should poke letters. Pablo, do you want to go ahead and talk about kind and kind?
Hey, hello. Yes, I don't know if you recall that we have this conversation some time ago. I think it was over to Slack, and it was Alvaro. His nick is Inertia. Actually, the kind in kind was his idea. And basically, it's because for those who are not familiar, briefly, the idea is that I have been playing with the idea of using kind as a cluster provider for testing the cluster API, which basically means deploying a controller that will call kind for providing another cluster. I mean, in a kind cluster will be a controller running that will deploy another independent cluster. That's basically the overall idea. Later on, and that's the most interesting idea, is that later on we want also be able to add nodes to an existing cluster using the same mechanism. So that basically means that the controller who is running in a kind cluster, which basically running in a Docker container, which is a node, and is running a Docker inside, this controller needs to talk to the outside Docker. I mean, to create another node controller, for instance, or another cluster. So Alvaro suggested, my initial idea was to run this controller not for testing, not inside the kind cluster, but outside, just listening, just to prevent this issue. If you look at the document I pointed out to in my comment over to Slack, and also in the issue that I created for this topic, there are like two options. This one was for me the less convenient but easy in the sense that it's clear. It's like something from the side running, just listening to the API server and watching for the events and acting on the kind because it's outside of the cluster. But Alvaro suggested the idea of running after the controller call run kind that the way I described it before. But that basically, what I don't like about this idea is that first we need to pass the Docker socket from the host down to the controller. That's one. And the second one is that then we need to change kind to tell which Docker socket to talk to. Because by default, it will try to call the local Docker because it's basically the code call Docker. So it's like two changes that the first one is kind of, okay, acceptable, but the second one is so ad hoc that was like saying it's ugly for, I don't know, it's for very specific use case, introducing one additional configuration or flag or everything. However, being honest, I've been unable to find out any other solution. So I just wanted to bring the comment because I want to move on the design. I mean, I still not implementing, but finally, so I want to move on and say, well, is this really make sense or not? So basically, I wanted some ideas of reviewers or your feedback on this particular issue.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this one a lot too. We can definitely like mount through the sockets. The question becomes like, can we keep the client version close enough to the host? And what about when we support other container runtimes? And
yeah,
running something on the host is not for great because now we have state, but potentially this thing that's running is, you know, a cluster API thing as opposed to ours. On the other hand, that does make having the Bootstrap cluster a little weird if you're like also running a component outside of basically a controller outside of the cluster. On the other hand, I think that's kind of what a cloud provider looks like. You have something running somewhere that you talk to that's outside the cluster.
Actually, my initial approach of running that outside is because what is running is not really the controller. I'm not, it was not precise in that description. What is running is the actuator. And the communication between the controller and the actuator can be anything. I mean, by default, it's kind of another element that we run inside. But actually, I've been working closely with the Gardener project, and they just started that proof of concept where they are running their actuator outside, and they communicate using gRPC. I don't really understand what the use case is, but it's actually something we run definitely outside the cluster. So it's kind of, we both arrive to more or less the same idea that you don't really need to run the actuator inside the cluster because, as you said, it can be something that you're running outside. I mean, you're in your infrastructure. So I have still the tendency of following this path. But as this work, there are some interest in the cluster API community for this use case. I need to check with them if this is acceptable for them. I mean, how to make this work in a test environment nicely. Because then you need to run this element, whatever it is, as a side kit of this test environment. Yeah, that's the only thing that I don't really like.
I feel like depending on how that component actually behaves, that might not be so bad to just kind of like background.
I have a question here. Sorry. So Pablo, isn't it the better way to? So currently, the cluster API already supports kind as a bootstrap cluster, and from there you can have a kind provisioner, machine provisioner. So isn't that like the better approach instead of kind in kind?
No. Actually, that's what I want to implement is a kind machine provisioner. But the kind machine provisioner needs to talk to kind, which is in the host. I mean, it's you have the controller, and actually, what I actually split this into the controller and the actuator. I mean, the controller is running definitely in the cluster. The actuator, the actual provider-dependent piece that, in this case, we call kind. I cannot make it run. I mean, I can make it run inside the cluster, but then we have all these problems. So my initial idea was to put it outside at the cell in the host, like a background process that Ben said. I mean, something that just is receiving this, watching for changes in the machine objects, and then or the cluster, depending which one, and then actuating on that. For me, that's the more natural way to do it. But as Alvaro mentioned this other idea, I was like playing with both. But the more I think about the kind in kind, is I see it is ugly because it's not only even the passing the socket that I said before is not the problem. The problem is that we need to change kind to accept that use case. Or I don't see there is any good reason.
Well, so mounting things is something I've actually been working on, and we're hopefully landing soon. Might also be an interesting topic for discussion. But like the problem with mounting things is like knowing what to mount, and then it's on the cluster API to like provision a kind of cluster that supports this use case. I think that might. I don't know if that like at what point that makes sense. Running the actuator outside seems like the sanest approach for now. Otherwise, we might get into some really bad situations where we've nested Docker too many levels deep and things start acting up, I imagine. Particularly given that like the like, for example, the C groups with V1, which is what all the container runtimes are using right now, can't actually be nested. They can kind of be mounted adjacent. So I'm not really sure Also, networking gets strange because you have like network namespaces and like overlapping space. So it might. I'm gonna guess that it's probably gonna behave the best if it uses an actuator on the host. I'm also going to guess that it's probably the simplest to manage and deploy, on the other hand, if it runs kind in kind. That said, we have had some funny issues with like mounts and C groups and things for like running kind on Kubernetes, just with a normal cluster, like GKE or something. I definitely think they're worth looking into, but I'm pretty sure the like most reliable one is going to be the actuator on the host, assuming the actuator is not going to like actually need to be run in a pod where it can be restarted when it panics or something like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, mostly also this is intended to be for testing. That's the whole
Right.
idea. So, I mean, it doesn't really need to be super reliable or anything. It's like, no. If it fails,
Yeah.
mostly because your test failed somehow. So,
I feel
anyway.
like it is maybe slightly worse UX to need to run the actuator, but on the other hand, like I feel like that's kind of close to like, turn on whatever your cloud thing is and then run the cluster API. And
Exactly.
if it's a real cloud, then you just get an account or something. But for kindness, like, okay, you don't need to make an account, but run this binary.
Okay.
That seems pretty reasonable. I would probably try that approach first.
Okay,
The other upside to that approach is that you're not blocked on any features and kind to continue to iterate on it.
That's true. That's the other point that I not really. I mean, as long as I can communicate from the controller to the actuator, which is running the side, but as you mentioned early in the comment around this threat of exposing ports, this is the opposite. It means it's calling from inside to the side. I understand that works. I haven't tried that, by the way, but
so yeah, so from like one workload in the cluster to somewhere else, that should work fine.
Yeah, and actually yes, because it's the case of the using the proxy.
Right. So
It's the same. It's just calling something which is side. Yeah, I tried that. It worked. It didn't work because I didn't have a proper proxy. I saw that there was a communication. The problem is that my proxy was not a proxy, so it was failing. But yeah, that worked.
Basically, the main problems we have are when you need to cross the bridge, and that may also. So actually, the one problem you may have with running on this host is in some places it may be tricky to actually dial to localhost outside of the net. But that's something we're probably going to need to figure out either way, how to make that work well.
What exactly the problem is?
So if you're inside the container and you're trying to dial local, like a port on localhost like outside the Docker bridge, I think that actually doesn't work right correctly, because it will, if you just do like say 127.0.1, you're going to actually dial loop back in the container.
I don't know, but as I know, I can pass. I mean, as I will launch the the Bootstrap cluster in kind, I will know the IP because it's the IP of the because it got
So let me understand. So you're going to have the thing from the outside the cluster dial in then? The actuator?
I can do a different way. I mean, I can just like call and set a configuration there. I mean, I can pass that or I can figure that out because it's at the end of the day, it's something I can parameterize because it's a storm first. But I know the IP address of the host before I launch the kind. It shouldn't be a problem.
I think I think though we may want to explore more of the like tunneling options. This may be a good way to find out what the problems that are there. I think I think in general, what we're going to wind up having to do is something like a well-supported path to like a SSH tunnel between the hosts in there. So just so that you can like open arbitrary ports and not have to run like a new container for each port. And so you can talk in both directions. Because then we could do something like on all of the nodes, we open a tunnel back out to the host machine, and there's some port you hit, and that actually goes to a local host on the outside, and that works both ways, and it's pretty flexible on how many ports and whatnot. I just not sure how what the easiest route is yet,
but
that may solve this problem, and I think
you
that we're
mean,
going to wind up needing to do this.
But you mean running? Because you mean running a container that do the tunneling?
The controller needs to talk to the actuator, right? And it goes
but the controller is inside the cluster,
right? And so
from inside to outside. It's not a dial-in. It's a dial-out.
Right. But so that works when it's talking to like say a public IP address, but for talking to localhost, that's actually problematic because it will get the container localhost instead of the host localhost.
Yeah.
But we could do kind of the opposite of what we're talking about for letting things from the outside talk to the inside with like kubectl port forward and do like a tunnel from inside the container network to the host.
Yes, because the problem is that I keep on thinking only in the Linux case where you have the bridge and that actually work, but in other...
Oh, right, yeah. For the bridge on Linux, it shouldn't be I think that should work fine, yeah. But we also probably want to support this on at least Mac.
Yeah. It's a good point. I always forget that because I don't have any little machine and most in my...
we could always prototype it on Linux only and come back to the Mac case later, because I think in general we're going to need to solve some kind of better tunneling option for this sort of stuff.
Okay, makes sense.
I'm not sure.
Right. Now I understand the problem, because I wasn't like getting the problem, because now I always forget that in Linux this is smooth because you have the bridge.
Right, and so as I've been thinking about that, I think we're going to wind up, for that case specifically, running something persistent-ish on the host that just is a command that handles or like the tunnels. And I think this is similar to what Minikube does currently.
Oh, really?
So I think I need to go look through it again, but we could have something that runs that like does tunnels of some form on the host, and then there are various ways we could put it in the network. We could like have a container that just does tunneling, or
okay,
it's like a separate node, or we could like schedule a deployment to the cluster that is like a daemon set on every machine that opens all of the ports that we're tunneling, or something like that.
But we need to know that in advance. I mean, which ports?
Well, we could reschedule the daemon set, right?
Oh.
And on the host side, we don't need to know the ports because we just have a binary that opens and closes ports as needed.
Okay, but that binary runs outside the...
Yeah, that's the same. We're probably going to wind up eventually need to do this anyhow, because the only other way I can think of that we solve this communication problem is we like spin up like a load balancer container or something like that for every port.
Yeah, exactly. That's the idea I had for this problem. I don't like it because I just said...
Or you like replace the current load balancer container.
Yeah.
But still, like that's going to be a lot more expensive and tricky to manage, I think, than just something that sits there listening and opens and closes ports and has some kind of like maybe SSH tunnel or something like that.
I will take a look at how Gardener do this, because they had a very rare architecture, and they actually have they use private Twitter network to reach the cluster rate, the API server of the cluster, because they have like a cluster for management and they have multiple clusters. They communicate. At that communication, they use a private VPN. So they are kind of managing.
Yeah. So I probably don't go into on this, but there's some similar ish stuff in ways at Google, and like the like GK today, the master is separate in a totally different location from the the users nodes, and that is just SSH tunnels, and that mechanism is in Kubernetes.
Yeah.
So we could probably maybe not necessarily actually SSH tunnels, but
I will look at what they do, basically how they manage that, because
that is the situation we're in. Where basically we have a private network that all the nodes are on, and then we have some other network that we want to be able to talk back and forth on. And it seems like pretty much the standard way to solve this is like SSH tunnels.
Okay, makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. Okay. Okay, I will keep on working on that direction, because if for you makes some sense, I will check back with the other people that has expressed some interest in this idea of using Kind as a cluster and machine provider for cluster, and see what they think about the idea of running this scikit for testing. And just explain why it makes more sense, because it's not obvious until you try to design that. I was trying to figure out and say, hey, I have a problem here, but okay, I will do that.
Thanks for looking at that. I'm super interested in this use case. I'm just like, don't have enough bandwidth to look into it much more right now. This is a really interesting problem.
Okay.
I have a question for everyone on the call. Has anyone else tried to actually run Kind and Kind, or have you? Anyone? No?
No, the only was this that you mentioned, that people running Kind inside Kubernetes, which is...
We're doing that pretty extensively, which is fun, but we have not actually tried to run like Kates on Kates on Kates yet.
Okay. That's funny.
I'm curious if anyone else has.
Maybe you can also, if you want to support some sort of a long-term solution for controlling Kind remotely, we can technically design a gRPC protocol, but that's like, if there is demand for that. And
I mean, that might be interesting. I think gRPC remote tunnels or reverse tunnels are also kind of a thing. So I guess if that's that one, I know we didn't really get much else on. Oh, wait, Lumir, you actually did get something else on. You want to talk about that?
So back on the previous note, we spoke briefly about C groups. I don't see in the base image Docker file, do we actually explicitly set the C group driver for the Docker that is inside the container?
We do not currently. We probably need to start bring Docker. That said, I'm also looking at, now that we have like image loading, I've been looking at how we can break dependencies on what exactly is in the node image. Like for example, today we don't assume anything about Kubernetes. Instead, we actually like kind of ask the node image, well, like what Kubernetes version do you have? And I'd like to do the same thing for runtime and CNI and that sort of thing. And as part of that, I'm also looking at, I'm not sure if Docker is the right CRI by default long term. It is easier to poke around at, but it encourages depending on being able to poke at the CRI and circumvent Kubernetes, which is harder for us to maintain. And it's not clear what the future of Docker as a CRI is, as opposed to like actual CRI implementations like Containerd or CRI-O.
So like Dims a couple of days ago brought the topic of like breaking out the shim from the kubelet. So I think what we should do is that we should follow the community, because the community currently is 70% Docker. And we cannot, I mean, we can force them to slowly transition.
That's what That's basically what I'm thinking, but I am thinking that that transition does probably look like, like for example, I believe the cluster API is using containerd. I believe that's kind of the transition towards. There's some nice things that we can do if we're specifically targeting that around things like mirroring and caching that are starting to land. It's designed to be pretty pluggable and not terrifically opinionated. But I think the slow transition path we can do for now is that Docker itself is starting to ship containerd underneath, I believe. So we can probably get to a point where we have an image that can run both because it is technically shipping both. And we can go from there. But long term, we probably also want to be able to say run cryo. So what I'd like to do instead is have everything kind of like check what's actually in the image at what version. So we can bake in this kind of information at build time. And that will let us solve things like I want a custom CNI, or maybe we have one that we ship by default, but we change that later. Instead of having the kind logic assume that like, okay, we're going to install leave, we can check for like a default manifest that's in the image and load that. Sorry, it's a bit off topic, but in general, I think we kind of have a problem there where like, not only are end users depending on like what exactly is in the node, we're kind of depending on a few of it ourselves in ways that are not great. Like Docker, we make some pretty strong assumptions that Docker is going to be available in the node extensively. It would be good if we could start identifying where that is and not do that. Actually know that we're using Docker and select Docker. And the same thing for the CNI and other things.
Yeah, but for instance, the Docker is important because as SUSE, we are using extensively all the runtime, so we need to be sure that work with both. Because we have somebody that work with one and another, so being.
I'm not actually expecting us to be super great for testing that exactly, but it will be really useful for things like the socket detection or passing through that correctly, or things like that that are just like at the kind of interface between the boot up and the CRI. For actually testing integration with the CRI, we definitely need real machines. So there's something else in here about cert copying?
Yes, so the logic that Fabrizio added for the HA supporting kind, it is using the so-called manual way of copying certificates. And now in kubeADM, we are adding the automatic way, but this means that we have to pass new flags to join an init. It's basically, like roughly speaking, it's going to copy the certs from the primary control plane to the new control planes that are joining the HA cluster. And this is done with a couple of flags on init and join. So the question here is like, do we want to add this supporting kind? Because the manual way also works.
It seems like kind of a low priority. We probably should long term, just so it's testable. But I have a couple, like, what is the mechanism by which it actually copies between the machines?
It loads the certs and packs them in a secret that is encrypted with an IS algorithm. And then after the secret expires, we use what was the name of reference count, not counting.
But how do you get the node access to the secret, seeing as it's the certs?
Well,
you have to share a key between the master and the node. So when you do init, you do kubemin init, upload the certs, and he write the cert in a secret in the cluster, but it gives you an encryption key. When you join, you make kubemin join -- download the cert and the decryption key.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this definitely sounds like something that we should be trying. Given that it works, though, I don't think that's like the the most important thing to plumb through right now. We have a lot of other work that could be super useful on cluster creation. That it kind of like something else I've been thinking about in general. The reason almost all of that is just an internal package right now is that the abstractions are pretty weak. It basically just has access to the entire context object, and there's sort of a hidden like circular dependency there between the create cuts and the actual context. I think we probably want to do some other fairly major refactoring of boot up. Similarly, right now you also pay, if the number of nodes that you have, which we're starting to notice as we're doing more CI with kind, you pay in serial boot up time for how many you have. I think we can probably refactor that quite a bit, and as we do that, we can also refactor how you're able to supply options to this. I mean, we're getting more options. For example, I did a little bit of this in the PR that's out right now to add mounts. We keep I've been meaning to write up. I think we should probably fix a bunch of this by just using the functional object options pattern. We keep adding more and more fields to these function calls, and they're getting a bit unwieldy, and it means it's a breaking change every time we add another thing that we're plumbing through, like say this key. With this pattern, we take a variable number of options in which are functions, and that actually change the internal options, and we can keep adding new options without breaking existing calls by just having a default.
In this case, we can also rely on the Kubernetes version for choosing one behavior or the other. So until 1.13 manual copy, 1.14 automatic copy. But it will in the long term, it will be interesting to have some flags.
Is this is this like a beta feature or alpha?
Alpha.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're going to need,
or at least this was the problem is that graduating to beta is linked to having code coverage. So we are kind in a circle.
Yeah, I think we're going to need to have another discussion at some point to think more about like how we handle doing alpha things, because probably we want some path for testing where we can do all of the alpha things, but for like cluster API bootstrap, we probably don't want to be shipping clusters that are using alpha everything all the time.
No, I agree. I think that the famous idea about unkind or kinder is the way out for those situations. I'm experiencing, I'm trying to prototype. I think that my impression is that the kind library is already good, and maybe the next Monday will show something to you if you have time. I have 2 or 3 points where the current kind library needs to be extended in order to support to cover more use case outside as a library, but they are really small changes, so they are not impacting, and they are, and I think that they can be accepted. My biggest problem, or my biggest, let me say, area to be addressed is the upgrade part, because I agree with you. It will be great to find a way to have the current Kubernetes build, kind build part more modular, so I can reuse to build also the target version of the grade. I don't know. Now, when we do upgrade, we test version upgrade from version X to version Z. Okay.
Yeah.
Version is the one that the kind start to, and then I need somewhere the artifact for version Z. And if I can reuse the same machinery to get those artifacts, it will be great.
I think we probably actually want to go on a route where we don't necessarily need to build to test this, where we could take 2 builds, because for CI purposes, pretty soon we're going to want to stop having every kind job do a build and just pick up, like push the build somewhere and pick up a build. We do this pretty heavily for every other way that we test Kubernetes, just to avoid that, like from the CI cluster point of view, one of the most expensive things we can do is build Kubernetes. It eats gobs of CPU and RAM, whereas like running an E2E test, not so much. So if we can, if we can pull builds,
makes really sense for me. So if I can start an upgrade saying, okay, I start kind mounting a directory that contains the artifact for the version in a well-known place, I'm practically done. I have already everything I need.
That actually dovetails nicely into the next point that Lubomir added that I was actually about to add. So
can I talk quickly
Sure.
about something else to interject another like feature request that has been out there for a while, and that's like provisioning the kind nodes without starting Kubernetes. And if we do this, we can basically exploit the fact that users can then decide what flags to run on the kind nodes.
I do think we should do that. I would like to see some more thought put into so something that I want to be able to stay away from, and I'm not sure how to reconcile this with, is having lots of disjoint flags where like, oh, whoops, you specified this flag, now everything else is invalid. And this kind of feature is going to, like, for example, the wait flag that we have today. I mean, and maybe the answer is we should move some of those things out of flags, or I don't know, but this one will definitely be another disjoint flag where things like waiting or whatever functionality you've specified for the CNI are not going to work, because we can't do those things until after Kubernetes has run.
Yes, definitely. But this is like a feature that a lot of users are going to find it useful.
I definitely think we should do it. I just basically, rather than going out today and adding that flag, I'd like to see some thought about like how we can solve this. I mean, this is a more general problem we have. We have another one with the with like where you can set the number of nodes with flags. I think we need to adopt some kind of strategy for how we want to say this is a flag, this is config, this is how we deal with having flags that are disjoint. I mean, another route we could do is say like a different subcommand. We could have like, I don't know what you'd name it, but cluster dash something, or just to clarify that like this has different behavior at a top level as opposed to like 50 different knobs on the same call, or
yes,
and maybe 50 different knobs on the same call is the right answer. I just think we should explore it a bit before we do it.
So you remember when we started adding all these flags, I pointed out to you that we should stop now.
Yeah.
Basically, the config of kind is a fairly small one. We could technically start forbidding stuff from the command line and start feeding stuff into the config right now. We can do this already, and we should do it now because the project is fairly young. If we decide to do it later,
Yeah, I'm kind of leaning that way myself. I think we can solve a lot of these problems this way, and I think it's a lot easier to like explain and validate like and structure config that is disjoint. Like you can have like an entire substructure of config that like is associated together, and like maybe you can only specify one or the other, something like how Kubernetes does volumes. But I don't know. I do think that's another discussion that we need more. And I do think we may have already added some flags that we should consider moving into config.
Yes, like weight and the other ones. We can definitely move them.
Yeah, but there is some really, there is a line where like we don't, I mean, some of this is just for us. Things like having the image as a flag could be really useful for just trying to use kind quickly and easily. And we don't want to like make it hard to use because it's easier for us. That said, I also don't think we should put everything in flags. I'm just not sure what the middle ground is. And this is a type of flag where like we're getting into that territory where I'm not sure which makes sense.
Yeah, we should.
For instance, this point to having the capability to start bare nodes ready to run Kubernetes is something that is one of the two problems, the two missing things that I saw in the library. And what I'm expecting is that kind of expose this in the library. I'm not expecting that kind will surface this in the UX, maybe in the config, but this is up to you.
Well, I could almost see us. I mean, so I could almost see us like as it matures, like maybe we only do in the library now, but as it matures, maybe what we could do is something like Kubernetes phases. I don't think we have enough of an idea of what the end state looks like to declare the phases today, but I think we probably could eventually say, okay, there's a phase for like creating the nodes, there's a phase for actually running Kubernetes, and there's a phase for like post-Kubernetes setup.
Yes,
maybe this is more granular than that.
What I was trying to say is that, okay, I think that exposing this to the user raise all the problems they're saying we want to give a clean surface. Why? If we stick on the library, currently the user of the library are very few, and we can clearly state that the library is in alpha state, and I can accept as being part of this group that the library can change.
Yeah, that's the common advice.
But from the other side, I accept this because I want to unblock some use cases without affecting the main project.
Yeah,
totally agree.
I think that is something that is valid, because I also I agree with you, because I've started like seeing that for my use cases, I need to shed a lot the user interface would make like no sense because it's very specific. So it's like we commented that the other day, that it's like keeping the binary of the kind common, like for the main use case, which is creating a cluster entirely and exposing everything else as an API, because otherwise it's really ugly. I mean, because for instance, for my use case, I need to get access to stuff like the QDAM token, so I can later on add additional nodes to the cluster and join the QDAM. So how do you do that in the user interface? It makes probably no sense.
Right. I totally agree. I just want to acknowledge that at some point, some of these things might also make sense to surface in the user interface. And something like provisioning bare nodes, I think enough, like say Kubernetes developers would use this, that it probably is eventually worth it. I'm not sure what it should look like though. And it would be good to explore that, because that comes in some of the same intersection of like, okay, we should move this into config, and like, how should we structure this so that we have room to add more options and avoid making it easy to write invalid configs. The same thing with flags, avoid making it easy to write what looks like a valid command line but won't work because, oh, you specified foo and bar, and you can't have those. Anyhow.
Okay, I suggest we move to the last topic because I see James and Fabrizio both are here. Ben submitted a PR that integrates the CRI API as part of the kind config. Not exactly, but he made a copy of a certain object from the CRI API. So first of all, I'm not sure, like both Fabrizio and James understand like API machinery probably better than me. And so the question here is like, we are exposing to the user something that is alpha fields, even if you are making a copy. So the question was, should we do this? Are there any concerns? Should we feature gate? So yeah, that's it.
The additional thing is there's actually 2 PRs open and they have different routes. One is that we actually take the upstream types and we embed them and we try to do something with that. The other is that, okay, we mimic the upstream type, but we don't guarantee that it's exactly the upstream type. We're using this for on disk, and ideally, eventually, it can actually be the upstream type and memory as well, and that'll be less work for us to shim. But I guess additional context is that technically CRI is V1 Alpha 2 still. It's not clear when they will actually move to beta. It's been pretty stable. There have been a few things that they've made breaking changes to, most of which I don't think are things that we touch. Also, specifically this type is mounts, which like hasn't changed at all for like 2 or 3 years now. But that doesn't mean the other types that we use won't. And it's not clear, like, should we be forking the types or not? I have found one use case for this that you'll find if you dig through the code a bit, where the on-disk format for that type is not for enums. For the generated protocode is not great because it's just the integer values as opposed to the named enum values. So this is talking about mount propagation. Instead of saying bidirectional, it's like 2 or something. So we've implemented custom serialization to use the enum names instead, which already makes it technically not the same as the upstream JSON type. That said, the upstream type is mostly being used as a protobuf type for talking to the gRPC CRA API. The CRA APIs are not actually expected to be exposed over anything besides proto. The on-disk formats are just for convenience.
Yeah, I've just been taking another look at it now. I tried to look earlier on the weekend. I think it looks good. I like the idea of definitely sticking to CRI for it. I think what you were saying about like copying the API versus vendoring it or whatever is, so like traditionally with most API machinery things, the advice is always to, I think at least, like you don't tend to import another API, like another random type from out that isn't specifically crafted to be a Kubernetes API type. As well, because this is used over gRPC. It looks like, just taking a quick glance, I haven't done a deep look, it looks like it is, a gRPC type. So I personally would feel like actually just writing our own basically identical abstraction on top might also insulate us from any breaking change they do make, and at least give us a little bit more to work with, where like we can realign ourselves. Yeah, and then I think the only other thing that I would add a comment, which has already been brought up, is like snake case versus camel case. I feel like we should just bite the bullet and go camel case now, personally.
So on that note, would you think that, so the idea I had for this is take what's there, but add another commit where we drop the pretense that this is just the cut and paste upstream type. I've also thought about making an auto generator. I think we can do that later, but essentially it should be, the process is take the upstream type, copy it, fix the JSON to actually be camel case, add custom serialization for enums so they're not terrible, that sort of thing, so that you're getting the same structure for sure. You did borrow that to get all the fields and everything, so that if you look through the commit history, it will be clear, okay, we borrowed this type at this point in time. But the immediate next step is, don't try to keep it exactly that type. Don't pretend it's that type. We're just mimicking it very closely.
Yeah, basically. And I think that'll make things like mount propagation not horrendous to deal. I mean, I think like non-propagation, we can actually do that like string-based enum types are done normally upstream, which is where you just like have a type alias for string. And then
We have so we have that implemented today, but it's actually using the generated enum values, which are also still bad. They're like all caps host _2 container. I think what we can do is have a commit which I'll add after this call if we're agreed on this, where we actually use what you would see in the, like you said, in the real Kubernetes API, there are some human friendlier names that map to the actual mount propagation values, and we can have the alias serialization to that.
Yeah, I guess the idea of having one commit, just adding the original ones, and then another one to fix it, just means if something does change, we can more easily rebase effectively in an ideal word.
I mean, I even thought about trying to write like one of those code generators that walks the types and rewrites the tags for JSON, but I don't think that's worth it right now, given that we have one type, well, two, the mount propagation. But the next step after this is, if it works well, I want to reuse other ideas like DNS and things. And the super long-term idea is that as long as this pans out, we could actually eventually have something that looks like kind config to internal CRI-ish type / our concept of what a node container looks like to actual CRI stuff to talk to a runtime somewhere. Whereas today that's more like kind config to CRI almost type to our sort of Docker shim thing, which was the other upside to using this type. We also didn't invent our own Docker or Docker shimming code for mounts. It's actually just take the upstream code and then prefix the values it generates with an actual Docker flag, as opposed to the they're using the client library, so it goes straight to just passing the string from the flag. So it's like a one-line diff. We just cut and pasted, didn't reinvent how to shim to Docker.
I wanted to ask, like, in terms of mount propagation and mounts, like exposing the functionality to the common kind user. So, you know, in kubeadm, we did basically, we have support for mounts, but it's very primitive. We don't expose underlying type. We basically support a bunch of strings for a mount. And it's a fairly sandboxed approach to what the users can do with the mounts. Do you think that we should do something like that instead and like completely hide the CRI type?
I mean, so out of the CRI type fields, I think all of these are things that I've seen are a problem with containerizing stuff that you need to set. You might need to disable SC Linux relabeling depending on what you're trying to mount. You might want to mark it read-only so that like you're mounting your source code through. Maybe you don't want to allow the things in the container to rewrite your source code. And mount propagation is maybe the only one where it's not entirely certain if you need it, but I don't think it really hurts us much because we are just supporting the same thing as what you see in Kubernetes APIs. And we know this design has proven out over a while and we're not reinventing it. I mean, we could drop that field. I think that's just kind of like removing possible functionality that costs us almost nothing.
Yes, it makes sense. Okay.
And it is an optional field, so we can avoid like referencing it in like the user-facing documentation. But for someone that goes and looks through GoDoc, like, yeah, if you need this, it's there.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, we can use like the type like so, even if the names are bad. I mean, the idea was to rename them, at least some of these bad names, I guess.
Well, so there's better names in the actual user-facing Kubernetes config. The enum names inside the CRI are not great, but if you look at the storage, they have like bidirectional as a name for one of the values.
The internal type.
Yeah, the internal type is not, but it matches very closely. These are essentially just the volume mounts that you have on your container.
Okay.
But there is another type that's in technically, I believe there's another type that's doing an alias that's actually in the pod spec as opposed to what's in CRI, because I think that actually maybe predates CRI.
Okay. I mean, I guess we can do it like that. Your PR is good. It implements the whole thing. Mike, I didn't want to balk or anything like that. I just wanted more people to comment on this.
Oh yeah, no, I was actually adding this to the agenda, and then I saw that you'd already done it. This one has been super iffy for me as well. I think the idea of at least borrowing stuff from what they've been up to with CRI and Docker Shim is going to be really helpful. It's not clear what's the best route to borrow it, and like if we're going to be able to fully commit to like say actually being a CRI client. But if nothing else, I think this PR saved us from like designing and implementing a bespoke host mount design to shim to Docker, and it also saved us from like just exposing adding arbitrary Docker flags, which will be helpful if we even just want to switch to using the client library as opposed to invoking the Docker binary.
Yeah, I understand. I just don't trust the Kubernetes API the alpha types because kubeproxy is alpha, and pretty soon it's going to break for a lot of people. Pretty soon, because like sequence lifecycle and the component config people are going to start refactoring the V1 alpha 1 of kubeproxy, and because it was delayed in alpha for such a long time, it gathered a lot of consumers, and now we have to break it.
Well, I will say I hear that concern, which is why I think I would like to go with the second route where we just copy the types so we can borrow the ideas without depending on the types. I hope that long term we can actually replace these types with a type alias and just put serialization aliases on them, but I don't want to depend on that. I will also say I spoke to some of the people that work on this offline, and yeah, they're not really they're not ready to commit to the time and not being allowed to break inness of like making this beta and exporting it just yet. That said, they also really don't want to see it broken because they also maintain implementations, and they've been pretty hesitant to make breaking changes in the past. There's been about one what was something related to identifying disks, because it did turn out that the design they were using didn't really work. But that is one of the more advanced corners that I think we'll probably never touch. And that was about a year ago.
Yeah, we are mostly safe on the mount side, like you say.
Right, and I think things like, so the other thing is I think large parts of the CRI we're never going to expose to the user. Like we're not going to let you configure the entire container, probably. That's something that we generate internally. But like the DNS and the host and maybe network configuration or things like that are probably pretty safe to expose. Things like disks or whatever don't really belong in kind, I think.
Yes, just the useful blobs.
Yeah, so I think just the useful blobs will actually get exposed, and then the other bits we can probably use internally, but then we have less concerns about breakage because it's all internal.
Yes. Now, like this week, I'm going to start adding some of the other kubeadm branch tests to use the new deployer. Thank you very much for helping me with this. If it didn't help this weekend, I was probably going to be stuck completely not being able to figure out because it was super tricky with the artifacts especially. And
well,
yeah,
I wanted to see that fixed anyway, but while we're being honest, I also realized things like kubetest 2 that were kind of itching at me that I haven't fully landed yet. It's a good time to land these things. I have to write up my yearly perf stuff this week. That's going to be nice to say, hey, look, we have the kubeadm thing actually working now, as opposed to like, it's almost there. So yeah, if you hit any more blockers, let me know. It helps me too.
Yeah, thanks. Do you want to change also the existing kind tests to the deployer?
I do once it's a little bit more stable. I noticed we're having some kind of strange issue where log dumping sometimes doesn't work. just once or twice, I haven't had a chance to find out why, and that's not something that we've been seeing in the other one. But I do think long term we should be switching both. The other reason I haven't switched everything yet is hopefully going to be fixed soon. The pod utilities, which are what we're using on those newer jobs, they are not providing the commit metadata as well, which is somewhat important when we're testing. I think kubetest actually already fixes this though, but we need to confirm that the commits are showing up in test grid before we switch. That's going to be problematic for things like blocking jobs. It's also hopefully getting fixed in PodUtils right now. I know Sen is working on it, but I've been hesitant to, significantly refactor the kind jobs because I know we need that fix, or at least I thought we did. And once we have that fix, it will make sense to just rewrite them to not use Bootstrap, not use scenarios, not use our own script, and go all in on just a pod utilities job that invokes kubetest directly, which is a lot more manageable and up to date.
Yeah, so I'm not sure what you mean by commit metadata, because I can still see the commits in the new job that we added.
So I think that I only recently discovered this. In one of the corners of kubetest, when you do a Kubernetes build, it will write out some metadata that identifies the version, which is solving our problem. For any other type of job, normally Bootstrap would record the checked out commit, the old Python script that we used at the beginning of the job, and the pod utilities were not necessarily doing that. They do record the ref checked out, but that's something like master, which isn't helpful.
Okay, I see. So that's like a bug. It requires a bug fix.
Yeah, but it's been known for a while, and we hadn't come to agreement on like what we wanted to do. I think it's moving forward now, but because of that reason, I hadn't wanted to migrate things off of kind of the clunkier old shell script stuff.
Okay.
Anybody else have anything? I know we ran over, but I'm not even in today, so it's fine.
It's a holiday in the United States.
Yeah, President's Day, to celebrate the presidents or something. Yeah, I don't know. Some of my friends are working anyhow. It kind of snuck upon us, so
yeah,
I didn't actually have anything planned. I will probably just as soon follow up on that Mount PR real quick after this.
Yeah, I'm going to work on. I sent a PR for attempting to fix the. So when you send a PR to KK, you receive a ton of emails. Will basically reducing the load. So I see that Eric has posted some comments on my PR. I should look at this later.
I would love to see that change. We need to get like agreement from everyone. We have to get like Contrabex to sign up on this. But yeah, Prow is the only CI system I've seen on GitHub that comments about everything that ever happens.
Yeah, it's super.
I'm not a fan. Not a fan.
Yeah, especially of new contributors. Like it's massive amounts of spam. I wanted to ask a quick question. We should probably end it. The GitHub client in test infra. It has a function for fetching the commits in the PR, like a list PRs for a list commits for a PR, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So this function, do you happen to know if it returns the commits in a chronological order?
I don't think it does, because GitHub themselves sorts commits by author date, I think, which is sort of chronological, but I think what you actually mean is the order in the tree.
Yeah, but that's going to be difficult to fetch, I guess.
Yeah, we've had a big problem with this and throughout their API, and we have some other code that will try to actually find the head commit, but I don't think we have code that actually gives you the tree sorted order currently, or like the logical commit order. Instead, most of GitHub's APIs sort based on the author date, which is probably the least useful way to sort it. because that's just the original date the commit was created. So even if you do something like rebase them or you amend the commit or something, you're still getting the author date, which like
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes. I'm going to look, but basically, to my understanding, it puts like the latest author date on top or something like that. The first item in the slice.
Yeah, but I think that's still all sorted by author date. We have some other code that finds the head commit.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to look at this later. Thanks. I forgot about this problem. Okay.
Thanks. Happy President's Day.
All right. Bye bye.